From the very beginning of Operation Epic Fury, President Trump stated this would be a 4 to 6 week military operation to dismantle the military threat posed by the radical Islamic Iranian regime.
There are 4 distinct documented data points in that segment, and each one deserves precise treatment. Data point 1, the original timeline statement. The administration publicly committed to a 3 to 4 week operational timeline at the initiation of Operation Epic Fury. That commitment was documented, stated publicly, and attributed to the president himself. It is in the permanent public record. I want to be analytically precise about what a publicly stated operational timeline represents. When an administration states a specific timeline for a military operation, it is not merely managing expectations. It is making a documented institutional commitment that can be measured against outcomes. A timeline stated publicly becomes a benchmark, a self-imposed standard against which the operation's actual duration is measured. Every week beyond that benchmark is a documented deviation from the administration's own stated framework. Data point 2, the revision. 3 to 4 weeks became 4 to 6 weeks. The revision was publicly announced, which means it was documented. The analytical significance is not merely that the timeline extended. It is what the extension documents, that the original framework was either inaccurate at the time it was stated, or became inaccurate in response to operational developments that the original framework did not account for. Either explanation is damaging as a documented assessment of pre-operational planning. Data point 3, the press secretaries claim that objectives were achieved and exceeded in 38 days. This statement is the most analytically interesting element in the clip because it is simultaneously a claim of success and evidence of the shifting objectives problem I described in the hook.
Thanks to the unbelievable capabilities of America's war fighters, the United States has achieved and exceeded those core military objectives in just 38.
If the core military objectives were achieved and exceeded in 38 days, the operation should have concluded at day 38. The documented fact that we are now in week 7, beyond day 49, well past the claimed achievement of objectives, is irreconcilable with the success claim unless the objectives that were achieved were different from the objectives currently being pursued. And if the objectives changed between day 38 and the current operational status, that change is itself evidence of the shifting objectives problem. Data point 4, Trump's 2015 statement about Obama and Iran deadlines. The source material presents this as hypocrisy, and the factual comparison is accurate. But the analytical significance is more precise than a hypocrisy observation. Trump's 2015 statement, Obama once again just missed a self-imposed deadline with Iran. Our leadership is weak and ineffective, is a documented public record of the standard Trump himself established for evaluating Iran policy. He committed on the record to the position that missing a self-imposed deadline on Iran constitutes weak and ineffective leadership. That documented standard is now applicable to the current administration's own documented timeline deviations. This is not a rhetorical point, it is an evidentiary one. The 2015 statement is in the permanent public record. It establishes, in Trump's own documented words, the metric by which Iran policy performance should be measured. And the current documented record, 2 timeline revisions, week 7, no negotiated resolution, does not meet that metric. The operational timeline, a documented sequence. Let me lay out the operational timeline in precise documented form because the sequence matters analytically, and the compressed framing in most coverage obscures how the deviations accumulated. The stated original commitment, 3 to 4 weeks. Publicly documented, attributed to the president, stated at the initiation of Operation Epic Fury. The first revision, 4 to 6 weeks. The timeline was publicly revised upward. This revision was documented. The press secretary's success claim, objectives achieved and exceeded in 38 days. Approximately 5.5 weeks, within the revised 4 to 6 week window. The current documented status, week 7, beyond the revised window. Active operational engagement continuing. No documented negotiated resolution. Strait of Hormuz status actively contested with contradictory official statements within the same operational period. This sequence documents 3 distinct timeline failures. The original 3 to 4 week commitment was not met. The revised 4 to 6 week commitment produced a claimed success at day 38 that was apparently insufficient to end operations, since operations continued past day 38. And the current week 7 status exceeds both stated windows without a documented resolution. Each failure is individually significant. In aggregate, they document a pattern of operational timeline management that has consistently understated the actual duration and complexity of the engagement, a pattern that is consistent with the pre-operational assessment having been inadequate to the actual scope of the challenge. Problem: building the documented record. I identified shifting objectives as the primary analytical signal for pre-operational planning inadequacy. Let me now build the documented record of how the stated objectives shifted across the operational timeline. Initial stated objective: dismantle the military threat posed by the Iranian regime. This is the language the press secretary used in the clip. It is broad, but it has a specific operational implication. The operation's success condition is the dismantling of a defined military threat capability. The nuclear dimension. The source material notes that at one point nuclear weapons, specifically preventing or eliminating Iran's nuclear capability, was a central stated objective. This is a more specific, verifiable objective than dismantling the military threat. Nuclear capability is measurable. Its elimination can be assessed through documented inspection, satellite imagery, intelligence assessment. The source further notes that by week 7, nuclear weapons were barely being talked about at this point in time, except when Trump goes, they won't agree on nuclear. That documented shift from nuclear capability as a central stated objective to nuclear capability being referenced primarily as an explanation for failed negotiations is the most significant single data point in the objectives analysis. Here is the precise analytical problem this shift creates. If nuclear capability elimination was a primary stated objective, and negotiations failed specifically because Iran would not agree to nuclear terms, the operation cannot be characterized as having achieved its core objectives, regardless of what military actions were accomplished on the ground. The objective that was not achieved, nuclear agreement, was the one the administration itself flagged as non-negotiable. The gap between that stated non-negotiability and the current operational status is a documented inconsistency. The regime change dimension. The source material references regime change as an objective that was at some point part of the stated framework. Regime change is a categorically different type of military objective than capability degradation. It requires not merely the destruction of specific infrastructure or the neutralization of specific military assets, but the replacement of the governing structure of a sovereign nation, an objective with a substantially different operational, legal, and diplomatic complexity profile. If regime change was a stated objective and is no longer being actively pursued, that represents a documented scaling back of the stated ambition. If it was never a formal stated objective and was referenced informally in the operational framing, its informal presence in the framework created public expectations that the formal objectives did not support. Either way, the documented record of what the operation was supposed to accomplish versus what it has accomplished is internally inconsistent in ways that cannot be resolved without a formal, documented assessment of what the current objectives actually are. The resources, oil dimension. The source references oil, specifically securing Iranian oil resources as part of the operational benefit structure as an element of the informal objective framework. If true as a documented goal, it adds a fourth dimension to the objectives landscape: military threat dismantlement, nuclear capability, regime change, and economic resource access. 4 distinct objectives with different operational requirements, different success conditions, and different timelines, being pursued simultaneously within an operational framework that was originally stated to last 3 to 4 weeks. The combination of multiple objectives, some formally stated and some informally referenced, with shifting emphasis over the course of the operation, is the documented architecture of the shifting objectives problem. And the shifting objectives problem is the documented architecture of strategic incoherence. The foundational context, the current situation cannot be understood without the source material makes a point that deserves formal analytical treatment rather than casual mention. If the administration's nuclear objective is preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons, that objective was being pursued through the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, until the Trump administration's documented withdrawal from it in 2018. The JCPOA was a multilateral agreement. The United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, China, and the European Union, with Iran, under which Iran agreed to specific, verifiable limitations on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. The agreement included documented inspection mechanisms, documented enrichment limits, documented stockpile caps, and a documented compliance monitoring structure. The Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA in May 2018. The documented stated rationale was that the agreement was inadequate, that it did not permanently prevent Iranian nuclear development, and that its sunset provisions allowed Iran to resume enrichment activities after a defined period. The analytical significance of that 2018 withdrawal for the current situation is specific. By exiting the multilateral diplomatic framework that was constraining Iranian nuclear activity through verified agreements, the administration removed the documented mechanisms for nuclear program limitation and replaced them with a policy of maximum pressure, escalating sanctions and diplomatic isolation that was intended to produce a new, more comprehensive agreement. That new agreement was not produced. Iran, freed from the JCPOA's constraints, accelerated its uranium enrichment program. By documented public reporting, Iran's enrichment levels reached the threshold of near weapons-grade material well above what the JCPOA permitted. The current military operation, in the context of this documented history, is the military response to a nuclear threat escalation that was itself a documented consequence of the diplomatic framework withdrawal in 2018. The strategic logic of the current situation: military action to address a nuclear threat that grew substantially after the diplomatic framework was abandoned, is the documented record. When Trump says negotiations failed because Iran won't agree on nuclear, he is describing the failure to achieve diplomatically what the JCPOA was achieving before the 2018 exit. That documented connection between the 2018 policy decision and the current military situation is the foundational context without which the operational timeline collapse cannot be fully understood. The Strait of Hormuz sequence is the single most analytically revealing documented event in the current operational status, and I want to give it the precise treatment it deserves. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman. Approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply and approximately 30% of seaborne oil trade transits through it. Its operational status is not a peripheral military detail. It is a direct, immediate determinant of global energy prices, of shipping insurance rates, of the economic planning calculations of every major economy that depends on Persian Gulf energy exports. The documented sequence: Trump publicly stated that Iran had opened the strait. Iran had not, in fact, opened it. This is documented in reporting from multiple independent sources. Trump then publicly announced he was closing the strait, reversing the position he had just stated Iran was enabling by opening it. The analytical significance of this sequence has three distinct dimensions. First, the factual accuracy problem. The President of the United States publicly stated as a fact that Iran had opened the Strait of Hormuz. That statement was factually inaccurate. The inaccuracy was documented by independent reporting. A public statement by the Commander-in-Chief about the operational status of the world's most strategically significant maritime choke point made in the context of an active military operation is not a casual comment subject to casual correction. It is a statement with documented consequences for markets, for allied diplomatic communications, for Iranian negotiating posture, and for the credibility of subsequent official statements about the same situation. Second, the reversal problem. The administration's stated position shifted from "the strait is open" to "we are closing the strait" within the same operational period. That reversal was publicly documented. Whatever the operational justification for the reversal, its existence in the documented record creates a specific credibility problem. The administration's official statements about the operational status of this waterway have proven unreliable within a very short documented time frame. That unreliability is itself a strategic liability. Allied governments, market participants, and adversaries all calibrate their responses to U.S. official statements in part based on their assessed reliability. A documented, unreliable official statement degrades that calibration for every subsequent statement. Third, the negotiation failure context. The Strait developments came in the immediate context of documented failed negotiations led by Vice President J.D. Vance. The negotiation failure is significant not just as a diplomatic setback, but as evidence bearing on the theory of victory question. If the administration's path to operational conclusion was through a negotiated settlement, and that negotiated path has documented failure, what is the current documented path to conclusion? The source raises the briefing question, specifically Fox News hosts questioning whether Trump was adequately briefed on operational risks. I want to address this analytically rather than rhetorically because it is a real institutional question with documented significance. Whether or not Trump received adequate pre-operational briefings is something this analysis cannot establish from the public record. The relevant intelligence assessments and briefing materials are classified. What the public documented record can establish is this: the combination of repeated timeline failures, shifting objectives, a factually inaccurate official statement about a strategic maritime waterway, and documented failed negotiations is consistent with a pre-operational framework that either underestimated the complexity of the engagement or did not adequately account for Iranian response options. The behavioral and outcomes record is what the documented public analysis can assess. The briefing question, while analytically relevant, remains in the realm of reporting rather than documented institutional record. The economic electoral calculus, building the documented framework. I want to move from the operational analysis to the economic electoral analysis because the connection between the two is a documented causal chain that has specific, predictable implications for the November 2026 midterms. The Strait of Hormuz's status is a direct determinant of global oil prices. When the strait is closed or its operational status is uncertain, the risk premium embedded in oil futures contracts rises. Rising oil futures prices translate into rising retail gasoline prices on a documented, predictable timeline, typically within weeks of futures market movement. Rising retail gasoline prices are among the most politically salient economic variables in the American electoral context. For a specific documented reason, gasoline prices are visible in a way that most economic indicators are not. Consumers encounter them multiple times per week in large format displays on roadside signage. They are experienced as immediate, personal, and attributable to policy. The documented history of American electoral behavior consistently shows a correlation between retail gasoline prices and incumbent party performance. This is not a contested empirical claim. It is a documented relationship in the electoral research literature. The causal mechanism is partially direct. Consumers attribute high gas prices to executive policy, and partially indirect, high gas prices compress consumer spending in other categories, affecting broader economic sentiment. Both mechanisms operate simultaneously and compound in their electoral effect. Now add the following documented variables to this framework. The strait's current operational status is uncertain, a direct consequence of the documented reversal sequence I analyzed in Block 4. Uncertainty in the strait produces elevated risk premiums in oil futures, regardless of whether the strait is technically open or closed, because market participants cannot reliably assess the operational risk based on official statements that have proven unreliable. The military operations duration is documented at week 7 and extending. Every week of active military engagement in the Persian Gulf region adds documented geopolitical risk premium to energy markets. This is not speculative. It is the documented market response to military activity in the world's most energy-sensitive geographic region. The negotiation failure documented in the Vance-led talks eliminates the most direct path to operational conclusion and risk premium reduction. Without a negotiated framework, the conditions that are producing elevated energy market uncertainty persist indefinitely. or until a military outcome is achieved that definitively resolves the operational situation. Trump's own documented acknowledgement. The source references Trump telling Maria Bartiromo that gas prices could be even higher in November than they are today. This is the most analytically significant single data point in the entire electoral calculus section, and I want to give it the weight it deserves. The President of the United States, speaking to a national media figure, acknowledged in documented public remarks that a direct economic consequence of his administration's military operation, elevated gasoline prices, may persist through and potentially worsen by the date of the November 2026 midterm elections. That is not an opposition research document. That is not a Democratic talking point. That is the Commander-in-Chief's own documented public assessment of the economic electoral consequences of his own policy. It is self-referential evidence of the highest order, the person most responsible for the policy and most invested in its political success, acknowledging on the record that its economic consequences may be electorally damaging. The exit problem. Why declaring victory and leaving has documented structural constraints. The source analysis correctly identifies what it calls the exit problem, the structural difficulty the administration faces in unilaterally declaring the operation concluded even when it wants to do so politically. I want to formalize this analysis because the exit problem has a specific documented structure that goes beyond the political optics of declaration, the Iran variable. The operation is not a unilateral American action that concludes when the United States decides to stop. It involves an adversary, Iran, that has its own documented capabilities, its own strategic interests, and its own decision-making about the operational environment. If the United States announces the operation concluded without a negotiated settlement, Iran retains the ability to take actions, keeping the strait operationally uncertain, continuing uranium enrichment, resuming proxy activities in the region that make the declaration of conclusion obviously inconsistent with the observable facts. The documented failure of the Vance-led negotiations is precisely relevant here. It establishes that a negotiated framework, which would provide a basis for a mutually acknowledged operational conclusion, has not been achieved. In the absence of that framework, a unilateral U.S. declaration of victory is vulnerable to Iranian actions that visibly undermine it. The domestic credibility variable. The administration has already made 2 documented timeline statements that proved inaccurate. A third statement, "It's over," issued without a negotiated framework and without a verifiable Iranian behavioral change, faces a documented credibility deficit created by the prior inaccurate statements. The administration's own public record makes it harder to produce a credible exit declaration. The nuclear objective variable. If nuclear program limitation was a stated objective, and Iran is documented as continuing enrichment activity at above JCPOA levels, a declaration of operational conclusion without a nuclear agreement leaves a documented objective unmet. Critics, including members of the president's own party who supported the operation on nuclear security grounds, have documented grounds to challenge the declaration as incomplete. These 3 structural constraints, adversary capability, domestic credibility deficit, unmet stated objective, do not make operational conclusion impossible. They do document why the simple political desire to declare the operation over is insufficient to actually produce an operationally and diplomatically coherent conclusion. The midterm electoral framework, integrating the documented variables. In episodes 3 and 5, I identified November 2026 as the structural decision point for the congressional accountability track. The Iran operation adds a specific documented economic variable to that framework. The midterm electoral environment will be shaped by multiple simultaneous documented developments. The legal proceedings track I have analyzed across this series, the congressional impeachment architecture documented in episode 5, the economic consequences of the Iran operation, and the baseline economic performance of the administration against its documented promises. The source material makes an analytical point that I want to develop with more precision. The Iran economy connection is likely to be more electorally determinative than other documented issues. Specifically, it is likely to be more determinative than the Epstein files, which I analyzed in episode 6. The analytical basis for this assessment is behavioral. Voters who are directly experiencing elevated gasoline prices, a documented, visible, personally felt economic consequence, are making an electoral calculation rooted in immediate personal economic experience. That calculation is documented in electoral research as among the most reliable predictors of incumbent party performance in midterm cycles.